When we think about women in the early republic, several notable women often come to mind. We have Deborah Sampson, right, who disguised herself as a man and served in the Continental Army. We have Phyllis Wheatley Peters, an enslaved poet who used her pen to challenge British tyranny and critique the hypocrisy of revolutionaries who held Africans and African Americans in bondage. And we also have Peggy Shippen Arnold, right, who's infamous for helping facilitate her husband's treason to the British Army. But perhaps no woman has dominated popular culture so much as Abigail Adams, who in March of 1776, 4 months before the Declaration was adopted, she famously urged her husband to, quote, "In the new code of laws, I would desire you remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Now, I wanted to start our discussion today with this quote because Abigail's request is really central to understanding gender relations in revolutionary America in the early republic. So, under the English common law doctrine of coverture, married women were legal dependents, meaning that they were essentially akin to children or enslaved or other types of bound laborers. Legally, they were classified as what was called femme couvres, which literally meant covered women. They were subsumed within their husband's legal and political identity. And so, unlike single women, unmarried women, including widows, for the most part, with a few exceptions, married women could not own property. They couldn't vote. They couldn't take on debts or conduct business in their own name. They couldn't testify in court. And with rare exceptions, they couldn't sue for divorce. And if they managed to do so, they almost certainly would not have gained custody of their children. In addition, kind of legally, there were no real crimes such as domestic abuse or marital rape. Husbands had the sole right to their wives' labors and sexuality. And in fact, in some ways during the colonial period, wife beating was actually condoned because it proved that a man was the master of his household and in control of his dependents. And this legal system is precisely what Abigail was challenging. She wasn't calling for universal suffrage or even women's full equality in the new nation. Rather, she wanted the new United States to institute legal protections for married women, or as she put it elsewhere in her correspondence, to put it out of the power of the arbitrary and tyrannic to abuse us or injure us with impunity. And Abigail actually related these efforts to her friend, Mercy Otis Warren, explaining that she'd written her husband and quote, ventured to speak a word on behalf of our sex, who are rather hardly dealt with by the laws of England, which gives such unlimited power to the husband to use his wife ill. Now, when John received his wife's letter, he somewhat laughingly expressed his hopes that General Washington and the rest of the Continental Army would fight rather than surrender to what he termed the despotism of the petticoat. Seeking to mollify Abigail, who John knew would not take his joke very kindly, he assured her that in practice, we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters. But for Abigail Adams and married women throughout revolutionary America, the law of coverture was far from theoretical. It was a legal code that governed their daily existence, that circumscribed their rights before the law. I cannot think you very generous to the ladies, Abigail countered, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. And this epistolary exchange between the Adamses highlights some of the most thorny questions about gender in the Revolutionary era. During the war, women participated in non-importation agreements. They boycotted tea, they made homespun clothing. They assumed management of family farms and launched new business ventures. They sold medicines, some did laundry and other housework, or they hawked imported goods to earn extra cash to keep their families fed amidst the scarcity of civil war. And as the conflict progressed, women found themselves residing amongst invading armies. Every day, they faced the danger of robbery, property destruction, violence, and rape. And enslaved women were especially vulnerable, likely to be kidnapped and subjected to forced labor or sold for profits. Now, women of all races and classes labored on the home front and in armies on both sides of the conflict during the Revolution, and their efforts were really critical to the supporting and waging of war. And like their male counterparts in this era, women also read revolutionary rhetoric. They heard the Declaration read from State House steps. They contemplated the meaning of liberty. And they too had a political awakening in the chaotic decades that led up to and continued into the American Revolution. But despite all of this, and despite Abigail's passionate appeal, the revolution's end in 1783 firmly kept coverture in place. And it cast a long shadow that endured for centuries. There's a brief exception in New Jersey, which I'm going to dive into more later in this presentation. But white women, for the most part, wouldn't gain the right to vote until 1920. In practice, most Black women had to wait an additional 45 years. It wasn't until the 1970s that American women could open a bank account or obtain credit in their own name. And laws against marital rape and domestic abuse weren't codified until the 1990s. And so recognizing this, right, and kind of the complaints that Abigail had at the outset of the war, what exactly did the American Revolution mean for American women? Now, I know you spent some time yesterday discussing Black women's experiences. So for the remainder of my time today, I'm going to consider this question primarily by focusing on the experience of white women, but I'll also work in other women's experiences where I can. And I'm going to do this through three different lenses: family life, education, and politics. So, the American Revolution coincided with two longer 18th century trends. The first being a shift towards a more private conception of the household, and secondly, the rise of companionate marriage. Now, before the late 18th century, American households were familial spaces, but they were also places of labor and production. Families farmed, they spun cloth, coopers, blacksmiths, and other artisans ran businesses from their homes. But by the late 18th century, production primarily moved out of the house and took place in designated male-dominated workplaces. Work, broadly, came to be understood as something that was done outside of the home and in exchange for wages. Consequently, the home itself came to be seen as a refuge, a haven from the chaos of domestic life, and one that was, for the most part, under women's control. And this also had the consequence of kind of veiling housework in this sheen, right? That's a labor of love rather than just labor, and something that's fundamentally distinct from the wage labor that's compensated by the marketplace. So there's all these changes happening in the way that Americans are thinking about the home and the family as the American Revolution is ongoing and then wrapping up. And at the same time, despite the persistence of coverture, throughout the Atlantic world, there were also emergent ideas about marriage as an affectionate partnership rather than a transaction. And this further altered domestic life. And in part, this shift in marriage was a consequence of Enlightenment thinking and the 18th century notion of sensibility, which posited that emotional connection and love and affection should be the foundation of social life rather than hierarchical, patriarchal relationships. And as you can see, right, this neatly intersects with some of the ideology of the revolution. And it's really appealing to families in the wake of the war. And so much so that it actually goes on to shape other relationships within the family, right? Especially those between parents and children. So having fought a war against tyranny, many parents were hesitant to impose their will on their lives of their children. Of course, citizens in a free republic were expected to govern themselves. And in the decades after the revolution, young Americans actually embraced a newfound individualism rooted in the rhetoric and the ideology of the revolution. And this had profound consequences for family life. Sons, for example, who had previously followed their father's businesses, started to chart their own paths, and they made their lives far from their hometowns. Daughters, too, pursued greater freedom. They sought out educational opportunities and more egalitarian marriages, at times without their family's consent. Another consequence of this trend in the early republic is we actually see divorce becoming more accessible, and birth rates declined as newly emboldened American women seized control of their futures and their fertility, sharing knowledge and strategies with one another as they thought about what they wanted their family and their lives to look like. And even women in happy marriages expected that their wartime contributions on the home front would continue in peace. And this is really exemplified by a letter from Lucy Knox, who wrote to her husband, Continental General Henry Knox, in 1777, informing him, quote, "I hope you will not consider yourself to be commander-in-chief of your own house. There is such thing as equal command." But family life also had national implications in the early republic. Now, the notion that the family was a model for political governance was not a new concept. In fact, it was quite old, right? Dating back to England, the king was the father of his people. The Puritans described the family as a little commonwealth in which family relations were modeled on those of the state. And so too did Americans in the early republic turn to the family as a model for republican governance in the new nation. In ideal companionate marriages, spouses were supposed to rationally evaluate their mates. They were to choose a partner of similar disposition and education and probably similar social status, traits that were calculated to bring about happiness. And it wasn't an egalitarian relationship, but marriage, as I said earlier, was supposed to be built on love and affection. And because of this, spouses were encouraged to subordinate their individual interests for the good of the partnership. And you can see, right, how this becomes a really appealing model for describing political life and social life in the new democratic republic, right, of the United States. Companionate marriage becomes the model for social and political relationships for American citizens. Now, another element of this is that according to contemporary political thought, a republic could only survive if its citizens were virtuous, meaning that they were willing to subordinate their private interest to the public good. And so this idea of cultivating virtue and fostering it becomes really critical to how Americans are thinking about family life in the early republic. But crucially, virtue itself was gendered. Right? It doesn't mean the same thing for men and women. For men, it meant acting selflessly in the public arena, fulfilling one's civic duty. For women, virtue had more of a private stance. It was tethered to sexual purity and prudence. And these gender roles were intended to be complementary, right? For a man to be a virtuous citizen and a good public actor, he required a virtuous partner, a woman who would help nurture his better instincts and encourage selfless behavior. And in the early republic, novels, newspapers, magazines, other types of popular writing helped to promote this ideal of republican marriage in which men and women worked together to cultivate the virtue that would sustain the republic and that they would instill it in their children. And so women were really crucial political actors in this process, right? They were their husband's confidants, they were their partners. They were also the primary caregivers who oversaw day-to-day life. They were tasked generally with raising the next generation of American citizens. And thus, although women's daily chores in the early republic may have been very similar to what they were doing before the war, right? To what their mothers did, to what their grandmothers did, the American Republican Project endowed these chores with new national and political significance many years after the American Revolution. Women came to be seen as having a unique moral authority that anchored the family and the nation, and that was a civic role, right, that was really integral to how the country would continue to grow and function. To kind of sum it up, right, women have a very real and a very influential role to play in national politics through their roles as wives and mothers. And the kind of prevailing thought here is that by exerting their moral authority within their families, American women would help to foster the civic virtue that would ensure the continuance and the functioning of the republic. And so historians have analyzed these trends, right? And they've come up with some terms to describe these politicized domestic roles, Republican mothers and Republican wives. Now, it's worth noting that these are ideals, okay? Ideals that were primarily accessible only to propertied, middling, elite, usually white women. These were the women who had the time and the wealth to focus their attention solely on domestic life. Laboring families of all races, right, could ill afford to sacrifice a woman's wage labor so that she could provide for a domestic haven. Enslaved families, like the one pictured here, were liable to be sold away from one another. They didn't even own their own labor or their own bodies. And of course, Same-sex couples, such as Vermont Taylor's Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake, whose 1807 union lasted for 44 years and whose families and neighbors recognized them as a married couple, were a far cry from how national politicians envisioned the Republican family. And I do want to point out, just kind of before I move off of this slide, these are silhouettes of Charity and Sylvia, and they are done very much stylistically in the way that silhouettes of married couples were done in the 19th century. And the kind of, what you see circled on the edges is actually hair that's woven together and then shaped into a heart. So it's very much emblematic of kind of their marital relationship. And so recognizing all of these complications, right, all of these nuances here, I want to underscore two things to keep in mind as we continue to talk about gender in the early republic. First, these ideals are very rarely universally applicable, right? Rather, they tend to put forth a single vision of kind of female participation in the republic that typically excludes those on the margins. And secondly, it's really helpful when we're talking about American gender roles in this period to consider the discrepancies between prescription and practice, right? What are people saying women should do? What are women actually doing? And then how in their daily lives are women themselves making choices that challenge these somewhat didactic gender roles. And in fact, what we see happening is that some women are quite adept at manipulating societal expectations of Republican motherhood or Republican wifedom, and that they use these social roles to actually advocate for greater equality and social power. And one of the real key areas where we see this happening is in the realm of education. So, as many American women and other reformers recognized, American women's new civic responsibilities would require an education beyond what was typically taught to young girls. During the colonial era, daughters of the elite tended to study music, dancing, French, maybe some needlework. A few might obtain a smattering of studies in history or geography, maybe grammar or some philosophy. But for most women, their education consisted only of rudimentary reading, writing, and some basic arithmetic skills. And so after independence, American women began to argue that in order to fulfill their civic roles as Republican mothers and Republican wives, they had to be better educated. And some women made this argument genuinely. Others did so because they recognized that this rhetoric of Republican motherhood could expedite their own access to education. And women's education was in fact a really hot topic in the 1790s. So in 1792, the English feminist author Mary Wollstonecraft published *In Vindication of the Rights of Woman*. The title was a reference to Thomas Paine's *The Rights of Man*, which had been published the previous year. And Paine argued for men's natural rights to property, suffrage, and participation in government. And so after reading this, right, Wollstonecraft takes this argument head on. She said that these rights, in kind of the way society is currently constructed, are only available to men, but that they shouldn't be, that women too are entitled to natural rights. And Wollstonecraft theorized that throughout history, women had been prevented from accessing their natural rights and had been kept in a state of subjugation, right, by their perceived inferior capabilities. But she took issue with this notion, right? She challenged it and argued that what seemed to be perceived differences in men and women's abilities was not natural or biological, but rather it was a consequence of women's comparative lack of education. And so education, Wollstonecraft posited, would enable women to become full contributing members of society. And this notion was really appealing, right? The book was a huge hit on both sides of the Atlantic. Men and women alike read Wollstonecraft's treatise. And for women in the United States, it really became a rallying cry for issues of women's rights and education. And Wollstonecraft herself actually became an enduring symbol of women's rights in the early national period. And we can see this, right? This is the title page from a ladies' magazine. And what it shows is, it's hard to see, but the kneeling woman is actually presenting the vindication of the rights of women to the figure of Liberty, right, who's often depicted as a Native woman. So you can see her on the left side of the image. And so really, the book goes on to have this like really symbolic hold within American culture. And there's a real change because of this desire for education, right? In the decades after the revolution, there are nearly 200 academies and seminaries that are founded throughout the country exclusively for women. And these primarily emerged in the decades between 1790 and 1830. And in part, right, these new academies are inspired by Mary Wollstonecraft and other educational reformers, but they're also speaking to this national desire to cultivate civic virtue among American women. Now, these new academies really expanded educational opportunities. They offered young women the types of educational experiences that were more akin to what their brothers might have had. The typical curriculum included the natural sciences, rhetoric and logic, history, geography, mathematics, literature and ethics, possibly Latin, and occasionally Greek. Right? So it's a much more substantial education than what women had been getting throughout the colonial period. Now, spots in these academies were almost exclusively limited to those of means. And Black women, regardless of social status, were excluded from attending. And these trends parallel what we see happening in male academies in the same period. And so because of this, right, in the early republic, increasingly an advanced education comes to be a marker of elite status, right? It becomes a really crucial factor in maintaining social and racial distinctions, even in the face of the revolution's leveling ideology. So it really helps create kind of this new American aristocratic elite. Now, armed with this new education and new ideas, in the early republic, daughters of the elite and middling classes were expected to become ideal Republican wives. They were educated, they were virtuous, they were socially savvy, and they were ready to use their skills not only for the betterment of themselves, but also for their family and for the nation. And there's some women, though, that want more. And we see this happening as early as 1790. Right? Women pick up their pens to challenge what they see is inequality in American society. Some, like Judith Sargent Murray, who we'll be reading later this morning, published political essays that made impassioned calls for women's education. Others turned their focus to novels, plays, or this new genre of women's magazines that emerged in this period, forms of popular culture that were really targeted at a female audience, right, and have a really wide popular reach. We start to see still other women starting to advocate for more expansive political rights, including suffrage. And so in the early decades of the Republic, what we see happening is American women having greater access to education and then seizing upon the moral authority that's endowed in their roles as Republican mothers and Republican wives to claim even more expansive public roles for themselves. And what we see happening actually is this proliferation of what are called female voluntary associations in the 19th century. And this is which educated women of means often come together in the name of reform and kind of voicing their moral authority and go out and seek to impose middle-class values on groups that they deem in need of reformation, which in the 19th century often took the form of the poor and the indigent, slaveholders, and sex workers. And so, although ostensibly apolitical, in the 19th century, what we see happening is American women making clear that they are not content to have this domestic role that's kind of circumscribed for them, and that they will be a political force to be reckoned with. Now, up to this point, I've primarily been focusing on women's private lives in the early national period. But women were also visible and influential political actors in the early national period, just not in the formal ways that we tend to think about politics. But women did show up in formal ways too, although their options were limited. So the first example is in New Jersey. Of all the new state constitutions that were drafted in 1776, kind of in preparation for independence, New Jersey alone enfranchised women. The state took revolutionary rhetoric to its logical conclusion, permitting all inhabitants, regardless of race or gender, to vote, as long as they met the 50-pound property qualification for suffrage. And this is, you can see in the text of the Constitution, right? They use the word inhabitant, which is gender and race neutral. And this is a really crucial distinction from other state constitutions in this period, which tended to use words like free man or free white man to delineate who was able to vote. Now, it's important to note that this 50-pound property qualification is actually a pretty high bar, right? Married women rarely held property in their own names, and so many of them didn't qualify to vote. Widows and other unmarried women who met the property requirements, however, were able to vote in New Jersey elections. And historians have actually uncovered evidence that 163 New Jersey women voted at all levels of elections, including local, state, and federal. Now, the fact that this was happening doesn't mean that everyone was okay with it, right? Or that it was widely lauded. In fact, there were very vocal critics, right? Critics who argued that female voters were degrading the political process, that they were undermining masculine authority, and that voting was unsexing women, right? And turning gender roles upside down. And one skeptic really summed up these critiques, complaining that, quote, the petticoat faction's a dangerous thing. Even so, both parties, Federalists and Republicans, continued to court female votes, recognizing that women voters could provide a slim margin of victory in close elections. Now, unfortunately, the New Jersey experiment in democracy was short-lived. There was a closely contested election in 1807, a controversial election in which at the end of it, there were allegations of voter fraud. Observers insisted that they had seen men going to the polls donning disguises as women and basically submitting multiple ballots. And so evaluating these claims, the state legislature moved to void the election and then also instituted measures to eliminate voter fraud in future elections. And this is where we see kind of party politics start to come into this issue. So the New Jersey Republican Party was convinced that female voters actually benefited their opponents, the Federalists. And so they moved to disenfranchise women as a political strategy. And similarly, the Federalist Party felt that Black voters tended to vote with the Republican Party. So they were also looking to negate those votes. And so what happens is the two parties strike a bargain. They both agree to relinquish their voter base. And then the legislature passes a new law that restricts suffrage only to white male citizens who pay taxes. And so what ends up happening is in 1807, this decision disenfranchises not only New Jersey women, but also free Black men who had likewise been voting since 1776. It was, in the words of one historian, a revolutionary backlash against the progress kind of in the decades after the revolution. And before going on, I do want to pause, and I gave you the link to this exhibit in the primary source handout as well. But the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia has a fabulous new exhibit about, I guess it's not so new anymore, it's about a year old, but about women voters in New Jersey and then throughout American history. And it's really great. I think it could be a fantastic teaching tool as well. There's a lot of primary sources and interactive ways for students to engage with kind of the materials and the records that the curators use to create this exhibit. And there's a lot of videos with the curators talking about how they did the research and the story they were telling. So I'd highly recommend checking it out, even if you don't use it in the classroom. It's really just very well done. And they've done a lot of work actually to identify these women who voted. They've put in an incredible amount of research to kind of expand what we know about women voters in the early republic. But elsewhere, right, not in New Jersey, women were excluded from suffrage altogether. But it doesn't mean that they didn't engage in politics. And what we see happening elsewhere, besides New Jersey, is that free white women are considered, in the words of one New York senator, to be what are called political beings. This means that they're counted as whole persons in the census, other than the 3/5 that an enslaved person counted as. They were entitled to the protections outlined in the Constitution, and they were guaranteed a broad array of civil liberties. And for women in the early republic, the most important of these liberties was the right of petition. As non-voting citizens, petitioning was a really critical way that women were able to make their voices heard to elected representatives. And one historian has found that at least 246 women submitted petitions to Congress in the years between 1789 and 1820. And the majority of these petitions, about 83%, were actually women seeking compensation for losses during the revolution or seeking pensions that were due to them for their husbands from the war. And the very act of submitting a petition, right, is a political act. It reveals the extent to which these women conceived of themselves as political actors, and that they believed that the government should be accountable to them, right? That they had a right to make a claim on the state, that they were owed something. And the very fact that the state responded to these claims was also an implicit recognition of women's rights as political rights bearers, right? That they have rights that the state is bound to recognize and to protect. Now, this might seem like kind of a small point, but it's actually really crucial for understanding white women's political position in the early republic. Because unlike enslaved people or free Blacks, white women were widely understood to have the moral authority and the civic authority to demand that the state protect their rights. But, and this is the big but, to be a rights bearer wasn't the same thing as citizenship. In fact, an 1805 case called Martin v. Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Supreme Court case about a property dispute, declared that a femme covert, meaning a married woman, is not a member of the state and has no political relation to the state any more than an alien, meaning a foreigner. So in short, right, what we see happening in these decades after the revolution as people are trying to figure out how women fit into the new republic is that women end up occupying this kind of, white women end up occupying this in-between status, right? They're inhabitants of the state, they're individual rights bearers, but they aren't necessarily citizens in the legal sense. And in fact, in subsequent decades, we'll see pro-slavery advocates actually citing this ambiguous status, women's ambiguous status, to defend the Three-Fifths Clause. Right? If white women, as these exemplary rights-bearing individuals, could not represent themselves, why then should it be any different for enslaved people? Now, despite these obstacles, right, women continued to insert themselves into the political affairs of the early republic. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, women were critical participants in the American Revolution, and their wartime experiences paved the way for a greater expansion of their roles in civic life. In the post-war years, American women continued the practices that they had honed during the fight for independence. They engaged in collective organizing. They participated in street demonstrations. They wrote political tracts. They petitioned. They fundraised. And many of these activities ended up coalescing around the French Revolution, which in the 1790s became this defining event in American political culture. Now, support for the French Revolution was deeply divisive in early American society. In the initial early months after the storming of the Bastille in 1789, Americans across the social spectrum and across the political spectrum celebrated what they saw as their allies engaging in a similar overthrow of monarchy. But in subsequent years, as circumstances in France deteriorated and became increasingly violent, support for the revolution really fractured along political party lines. So Democratic Republicans, or Republicans, which is the party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, continued to staunchly support the French revolutionary government. But their political opponents, the Federalists, which is the party of George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, became increasingly skeptical of what they saw as the excesses of mob rule and too much democracy basically taking place in France. Now, of course, American women couldn't vote as political parties kind of debated what to do about the French Revolution and how involved to get. But they read about it in newspapers and in magazines. They formed their own opinions about the uprising, and they compared French women's actions to their own wartime experiences. And when political parties staged demonstrations either for or against the French Revolution, women were there. Right? They took part in these events. And one of the main ways that they do this is actually through fashion, right? Just as homespun had been a powerful political statement during the American Revolution, American women adopted French fashion to show their support for revolutionaries. Others donned liberty caps, which became a symbol of the French Revolution, or they pinned tricolored cockades or black silk roses to their breasts to signify their politics. Still others joined in public demonstrations, or they took part in parades. They sang public songs, they baked cakes, they gave toasts. Some women even published their opinions in newspaper essays. And we have some examples of women in their correspondence addressing one another with the egalitarian title of citizen, right, which kind of comes from the French Revolution, showing just kind of how deeply women are consuming news about this event, right, and kind of integrating it into their own lives. In surveying the political landscape, one Philadelphia newspaper editor bemoaned women's political fervor, decrying what he termed these fiery Frenchified dames. Now, for American women, in contrast, right, the French Revolution and debates over the French Revolution offered them a moment, right? They offered language and symbols and an opportunity to express their political identities in new ways. And even as debates over the French Revolution cooled as the 1790s progressed, women continued to participate in political theater, right? They kind of engaged in these practices early on in the 1790s and continued to persist in them. And what we see happening, an example of this is in 1798, right? So public sentiment at this point pretty much turned against France after French agents tried to bribe American diplomats, a scandal that came to be known as the XYZ affair. And so Americans at this point basically prepared for war. They were expecting invasion. And American women start stitching flags, and they present them to local militias in these highly ritualized ceremonies and events. And then following the ceremony, women would be active participants in the toasts, right, or lead processions that took place to celebrate the militias. And similar types of events happened on the 4th of July. Newspapers throughout the country reported that the national celebrations of independence really kind of had, women were big, present, and very involved figures in these events, right? They were not just spectators, but also sometimes taking on leadership roles in these festivities. And so in the first decade of the Republic, women were visible and really essential participants in the festive national culture of the United States. Now, women's political roles only increased in subsequent years as women were drawn into partisan politics that characterized the first party system. Both Federalists and Republicans courted female supporters, and they really recognized that they were important political actors, right? They could be participants, spectators, or simply symbols, but both parties recognized women's power kind of in the political arena. And this doesn't mean, however, that they didn't criticize the other party when they invoked women. It was a really easy way to score political points. But women also created political spaces for themselves in the early Republic. And one of the ways we see this is salons, right, which come out of European Enlightenment culture. In the 1790s, American women start hosting salons in the federal capital, which starts in New York and then moves to Philadelphia and then finally ends up in DC in 1800. And salons were informal venues, right, for mixed gender socialization in which men and women came together to socialize, discuss culture, debate intellectual trends. And they were almost exclusively hosted by women, right? So these are political spaces under women's control. And we see this taking root even at the national level, right? So during the Washington administration, Martha Washington established the precedent of First Ladies' drawing rooms. Once a week, men and women in the capital elite would gather for polite conversation and light refreshment. These events fostered conversation between various actors in political life. But they were also state affairs, right? These are the same receptions that would host diplomats or other visitors of state. They were intended to demonstrate this uniquely American approach to politics, right? To project gravitas while avoiding the ostentatious displays that characterized European courts. And there are other salons that take place as well, right? And kind of other government wives host these events. And those ones are a little bit less formal than Martha's drawing rooms because they don't have the veneer kind of a state function, right? But the First Lady's drawing room becomes this cultural institution. Abigail Adams continues it during the Adams administration. Abigail herself was a very skilled politician, right? She was well known as an advisor to her husband. And so during the Adams administration, Abigail's drawing rooms really enlarged the sphere of women's political access, right? They became places not just of social gathering, but where informal politics could happen, right? Men and women could broker patronage or trade political gossip. They could discuss political matters with senators and congressmen, convey their sentiments to powerful men, right? You could perhaps put them into action. And women's presence in early national politics wasn't limited to kind of these social gatherings either. In fact, women were regular participants at formal ceremonies and events, such as the opening of Congress. And women were also regular observers of the ongoing proceedings in the House of Representatives. The Senate was closed to public observance in the early years of the Republic, but the House was open. And there was actually a section reserved for women to come and watch the debates. And so as the national elite really coalesces around the federal capital, women were an integral part of these gatherings and really vital participants in this political culture of the new nation. And Dolly Madison ends up being the one who kind of puts a stamp on all of this, right? Who succeeds in creating a lasting informal political sphere that really becomes central to American politics. And so Dolly actually becomes kind of the leading hostess of Washington when Thomas Jefferson assumes the presidency in 1801. And this is in part because Jefferson's unmarried, but Jefferson also dismantled this tradition of drawing rooms, right? He was the figurehead of a Democratic Republican Party that had been really skeptical of these gatherings as, having too many echoes of monarchy. And so to fill the gap in Washington's social calendar, Dolly Madison begins hosting her own events, right? She's the wife of the Secretary of State, James Madison. And Dolly is, by all accounts, she's a consummate politician, right? She's charming, she's vivacious, she's really intelligent, she thrives in these social settings. And because of this, her drawing rooms, although following in the vein of Abigail Adams and Martha Washington, really are more festive and more informal, right? They're more akin to what we would call, more akin to like the modern cocktail party, right? And initially, the drawing rooms are wide open to anyone who wants to attend. At one point, Dolly even advertises them in the newspaper. But soon they got so full, right, so crowded that the Madisons attempted to limit them to people that they actually knew. But even that seems to have been enforced only haphazardly. So each week in DC, men and women would gather at the Madison's house to discuss politics, to gossip, and to otherwise socialize. And these events provided opportunities for freewheeling conversation and debate, right, as well as private conversation among the political elites. And it was really common, right, for politics to take place in these spaces, just as we kind of started to see under Abigail Adams' tenure, right? Deals are made here, patronage is brokered, gossip is exchanged. And women are really critical participants in how all of these things unfold. They lobby for positions for their family members. They exert informal influence on politicians and policies. So in short, these drawing rooms, right, create this very informal atmosphere and a real fluid space where both men and women are engaged in the practice of politics in the early republic. In fact, it's a new kind of politics, what one historian has termed parlor politics. And perhaps gesturing to just how popular these drawing rooms were, how important they were in the political culture of DC, because of her role in kind of creating these social events. Dolly Madison was affectionately called during the Madison presidency the Lady President, the Presidentess, and the Queen of Washington City. So as I wrap up, right, by virtue of a lot of the nature of politics in the early republic, a lot of my time today has focused on the political roles of elite and middling white women. And in part, this is because they were the ones that contemporaries regarded as political actors and as rights bearers, right? They were the ones who had access to the educational opportunities and the social status to become Republican wives and mothers. But I want to underscore, right, that they are not the only women to take political action in this period. Every day, Black and Indigenous women challenged prevailing racial and gender systems in an effort to secure their futures and those of their families. Black women, both free and enslaved, fought against slavery. Native women fought to protect their lands from encroachment and to preserve their culture amidst forced removal. And these two were deeply political actions, right? Even if they don't occur in the salons of DC or the ballot boxes in New Jersey. And so really what I want to take away, I hope you take away today, is that the story of women in politics in the early republic is really complicated, right? Legally, very little changes. Coverture persisted, women were barred, largely from suffrage. They were encouraged to devote their time to domestic pursuits. And because of this, at first glance, their political presence almost seems invisible, right? But if we look beyond the arenas of formal politics to family life, to education, to the streets and parlors of the early republic, we can see how these elite women, elite white women, appropriated some political power for themselves and how they were critical participants in the establishment of this public domain that existed outside the realms of formal politics. That women really were central creators of the early American Republic and its government. Their efforts just took place in spaces where we don't often think to look. Thank you.